we're destroying that most precious and valuable asset that we have. The origin of life on Earth is water, and we've got to stop doing it.
It's heartbreaking. We have allowed a situation where, due to human activity, we are having an incredible impact on the natural environment that sustains us.
Wow. It's so obviously a sick ecology. Any lay person could look at it and go, there's something wrong there, you know. We've had a 6-fold increase in the last 30 years of fertiliser use to drive that dairy intensification. And all that leaching and runoff of that nutrient goes into these freshwater systems and kills them. I mean, we're destroying that most precious and valuable asset that we have. The origin of life on Earth is water. And here we are treating it as a dumping ground for the byproduct of this industrial agricultural system. And we've got to stop doing it.
Well, rivers and lakes for some Māori are, the very breath of Papatūānuku. They some would describe the rivers and lakes as veins, and tributaries are veins of Papatūānuku. We've always talked about the importance of water as Indigenous people, how our lakes and rivers are important not only for those, mahinga kai, those practices of our food system, but also, to replenish us in a spiritual sense. Many people talk about, slightly different, going to the sea to refresh. Rivers and lakes do the same for Māori and for many cultures.
Ko kahurānagi te maunga, ko ngaruroro te awa, ko kohu pātiki te marae, ko Ngāti Hore te hapu, ko Aki ahau. My name is Aki, and Kahurānagi is my mountain. Ngaruroro moko tuararo ki rangatira is my river. Kohu Pātiki is my marae, and Ngāti Hore is my clan. Kia ora. As you can see, the river, the velocity is gone. It was diverted in '69 for flood reasons, and so we have slow moving waters. And what that does, it has an effect on our migrating species, i.e. the longfin tuna and the black flounder. These are endemic to our waters here. We are overrun with zinc in this river to extreme of what the above normal should be. Zinc comes from runoff from roofs and all kinds of materials. We have industrial here, from tanning to preserving fruits, etc., so they all add in the runoff to some degree. We have occasional spills which affect the river. The velocity cannot transport this out fast enough to the ocean to have it purified, so it sinks and just builds up the sedimentation.
Today we're having the second part of an Environment Court hearing on a case for a water conservation order on the Ngaruroro River. There was an application put forward for a water conservation order on the river from source to the sea, basically. A water conservation order is a bit like having a national park on a river. That's kind of the comparison that's often given. You're really just saying these things are outstanding and we need to protect them as they are now. The prime reason for a water conservation order on the Ngaruroro is that the river is outstanding. It's really incredible, particularly up in the Kawika Ranges and towards its headwaters. But the lower river, where there's this amazing braided habitat, is really incredible as well. And these places are really important for lots of our native birds that come and nest on braided rivers, but also for our fish. Once you hit the plains, there's a lot of activity, farming and horticulture and things around the river. We had a regional council that was grossly over-allocating groundwater takes for horticulture and farming and things like that. And we weren't really seeing the protection that people thought the river deserved. Regional councils only ever write their plans for kind of 10 years, and governments come and go, things change, sometimes things are strengthened, sometimes things are weakened. Water conservation orders kind of stand in perpetuity. So if you get a water conservation order, it says this river's outstanding, you have to protect it, and that onus doesn't kind of go away. It can't be changed if a regional councillor is voted in or out, or if staff change, or if the government changes it. It's really a perpetual recognition of something incredible that should be kind of saved for future generations.
The river used to sing, because you could hear that when it runs over, bubbles over rocks and things. It has a hum, and we don't have that now. I was born here on this river, and so as a child, we spent all our time here. My dad took me fishing when I was 5 years old, and I fished all up to my adult years with him for the marae, for the community, for the family. Gangs were not a big, huge deal in those days. Everybody felt welcome because we all participated together. But nowadays, it's more separation than it is togetherness. So I find that a great cultural impact.
Well, we're out here in the Ashley, and this lowland river, it tends to dry up, and what happens is as the river starts to drop, you end up with these pools. And so we're here to try and rescue the fish that get stuck in these pools. The pools get smaller and smaller, and the water gets warmer and warmer. The oxygen drops, and it's really dangerous for the fish. They'll run out of water and they'll die. So we've got sending a current down through this wand, and what it does is it gives the fish just a little bit of a shock, and it floats to the surface, and we can net it then, and then the fish recovers from that afterwards. We're worried that this pool might dry up because the Ashley's getting really low, so we want to make sure that we move them on before the conditions become unsuitable for them and they'll die. Sometimes you'd come back and you'll see a dry riverbed with skeletons of dead fish on them because the pools have dried up and there's nowhere for them to go.
As a river disconnects and dries, it just makes me sad, both as a scientist but also just as a human. The water levels drop. First off, that breaks the river. So species which migrate can no longer migrate. As the river keeps drying, then you start to see loss of water quality, nutrients tend to accumulate, you start to get algal blooms, the oxygen levels drop, animals will start to gasp for oxygen. At that point, you often start to see predators moving in and taking those individuals which are struggling. If the river continues to drop, then things will just suffocate and they'll just die. And at the end, when there's no water left in the system, and when it's no longer a river, it's lost pretty much all the value it might have for both the organisms that live there and to us as well. And it has no value anymore.
The Ashley is a classic sort of lowland Canterbury river in that it's getting it from all sides really. There's pressure from abstraction, climate, and also, I mean, even the increase in development of lifestyle blocks and things in the area.
We take staggering amounts of water from our waterways. We've got a historic legacy of poor management of rivers, and really over the past 150 years, the water take from rivers has almost been unregulated. So a lot of the rivers in Otago and Canterbury actually run dry. It's not only the direct take from the rivers, but it's also the take from the groundwater, which reduces the amount of groundwater in the surrounding landscape.
Canterbury has, you know, an immense water supply. It has huge aquifers, and when I grew up was known as a place with some of the best drinking water ever. And yet now we have lots of environmental concerns around water. We have less water, we have more degraded rivers, we have polluted water. Our drinking water is even, you know, suspect now for the first time in my lifetime in Canterbury. So we have some real challenges. From a science perspective, they'll probably easily fix some of them if we made some decisions about how we protect our drinking water, how we stop pulling water out of the aquifers. Those decisions are relatively easy in isolation. If I said no more, you know, water out of the aquifers for primary industries, no more dairy farming in Canterbury, that impacts people's livelihoods. And so the complexity of the issue then is, you know, is almost insurmountable. And so as a country, I think we need to have a mature conversation about what we want our environment to look like in 100 years' time. We need to agree on it.
Historically, we've developed these industries that people have relied on for their incomes and for their livelihoods, providing, you know, food and goods and services that people buy and do want to eat or to consume, and now we're saying actually there are consequences to that, and we need to change. In New Zealand, we have made it very difficult for ourselves to regulate for the environment. As a result of that, you know, you've now got a situation where we're trying to get on top of that, trying to fix a lot of these things all at once, and now people are screaming out that there's too much environmental regulation all at once. But I think that's just because the bow wave of what's rolled through over the course of the last several decades has gotten to the point where we're saying, you know what, if we allow this to carry on much further, things are going to get really bad. So we need to move quickly on some of this stuff.
So in terms of loss of biodiversity in freshwater fish, probably at a global scale we see about 1/3 of freshwater fish which are threatened at some level, probably at risk of loss or possibly extinction within the next sort of 100 years. We've had multiple policies coming up over the past 20, 30 years, but they tend to read better than what actually happens on the ground. You look at the amount of money that, say, goes into the conservation of, like you said, freshwater fish maybe, or the small things that we don't think about all that often, then the amount of resources, relative to what we spend on other things is often relatively small.
It's not only the ecosystems we're losing, we're also losing that quality of life that is characteristic of living in New Zealand, that you can go and swim at the local lake and the local river, you can fish. In the space of a generation, there's a whole lot of kids growing up who are told you don't go near the river, you don't touch the river. And I find that a deeply sad thing. We need to decide once again, what is it we want this nation to be? Do we want it to be this, Eurotrophic soup of dead water and dairy cows and pasture? Or do we want it to be a place of diverse food production that is sustainable for generations to come, where the rivers are clean and flowing clear and our kids can safely swim in them? And I think honestly, if you asked any New Zealander, they would answer the latter.
If your biggest, strongest, tallest member of the forest family is sick, that sends a very strong message that something's not right and that you have to do something about it.